Uncannily and seemingly irrelevant details held minds of hideous possibilities. A new and burning curiosity grew in me, compared to which my boyish curiosity was feeble and inchoate. The first revelation led to an exhaustive research, and finally to that shuddering quest which proved so disastrous to myself and mine. For at the last, my uncle insisted on joining the search I had commenced, and after a certain night in that house, he did not come away with me. I am lonely with that gentle soul whose long years were filled only with honor, virtue, good taste, benevolence, and learning. I have reared a marble urn to his memory in St. John's churchyard, the place that Poe loved, the hidden grove of giant willows on the hill, where tombs and headstones huddle quietly between the hoary bulk of the church and the houses and bank walls of Benefit Street. The history of the house, opening amidst a maze of dates, revealed no trace of the sinister either about its construction or about the prosperous and honorable family who built it. Yet, from the first, a taint of calamity soon increased to boding significance was apparent. My uncle's carefully compiled record began with the building of the structure in 1763, and followed the theme with an unusual amount of detail. The Shunned House, it seems, was first inhabited by William Harris and his wife, Roby Dexter, with their children, Elkanah, born in 1755, Abigail, born in 1757, William Jr., born in 1759, and Ruth, born in 1761. Harris was a substantial merchant and seaman in the West India trade, connected with the firm of Obadiah Brown and his nephews. After Brown's death in 1761, the new firm of Nicholas Brown and Company made him master of the brig Prudence, Providence built, of 120 tons, thus enabling him to erect the new homestead he had desired ever since his marriage. The site he had chosen, a recently straightened part of the new and fashionable back street, which ran along the side of the hill above crowded Cheapside, was all that could be wished, and the building did justice to the location. It was the best that moderate means could afford, and Harris hastened to move in before the birth of a fifth child, which the family, that child, a boy, came in December, but was stillborn. Nor was any child to be born alive in that house for a century and a half. The next April, sickness occurred among the children, and Abigail and Ruth died before the month was over. Dr. Job Ives diagnosed the trouble as some infantile fever, though others declared it was more of a mere wasting away or decline. It seemed, in any event, to be contagious, for Hannah Bowen, one of the two servants, died of it in the following June. Ellie Lediason, the other servant, constantly complained of weakness and would return to his father's farm. And would have returned to his father's farm in Rehoboth, but for a sudden attachment of Mahitabel Pierce was hired to succeed Hannah. He died the next year, a sad year indeed, since it marked the death of William Harris himself, enfeebled as he was by the climate of Martinique, where his occupation had kept him for considerable periods during the preceding decade. The widowed Robbie Harris never recovered from the shock of her husband's death and the passing of her firstborn, Elkanah, 2 years later, was the final blow to her reason. In 1768, she fell victim to a mild form of insanity, and was therefore confined to the upper part of the house. Her elder maiden sister, Mercy Dexter, having moved in to take charge of the family. Mercy was a plain, raw-boned woman of great strength, but her health visibly declined from the time of her advent. She was greatly devoted to her unfortunate sister, and had an especial affection for our only starving nephew, William, who from a sturdy infant had become a sickly, spindling lad. In this year the servant Mehetabel died, and the other servant, Preserved Smith, left without coherent explanation, or at least with only some wild tales and a complaint that he had disliked the smell of the place. For a time, Mercy could secure no more help, since 7 deaths and cases of madness, all occurring within 5 years' space, had begun to set in motion the body of fireside rumor, which became so bizarre. Ultimately, however, she obtained new servants from out of town. Anne White, a morose woman from that part of North Kingstown, now set off as the township of Exeter, and a capable Boston man named Zenas Lowe. It was Anne White who first gave definite shape to the sinister idle talk. Mercy should have known better than to hire anyone from the Nooseneck Hill country, for that remote bit of backwoods was then, just as now, a seat of the most uncomfortable superstitions. As lately as 1892, an Exeter community exhumed a dead body and ceremoniously burnt its heart in order to prevent certain alleged visitations injurious to the public health and peace. One may imagine the point of view of the same section in 1768. Anne's tongue was perniciously active, and within a few months Mercy discharged her, filling her place with a faithful and amiable Amazon from Newport, Maria Robbins. Meanwhile, poor Roby Harris, in her madness, gave voice to dreams and imaginings of the most hideous sort. At times her screams became insupportable, and for long periods she would utter shrieking horrors which necessitated her son's temporary residence with his cousin, Peleg Harris, in Presbyterian Lane. Near the new college building, the boy would seem to improve after these visits, and had Mercy been as wise as she was well-meaning, she would have let him live permanently with Peleg. Just what Miss Harris cried out in her fits of violence, tradition hesitates to say, or rather presents such extravagant accounts that nullify themselves through sheer absurdity. Certainly it sounds absurd here that a woman educated only in the rudiments of French often shouted for hours in a coarse and idiomatic form of that language, or that the same person alone and guarded complained wildly of a staring thing which bit and chewed at her. In 1772, the servant Zenas died. When Miss Harris heard of it, she laughed with a shocking delight, utterly foreign to her. The next year, she herself died, and was laid to rest in the North Burial Ground beside her husband. Upon the outbreak of trouble with Great Britain in 1775, William Harris, despite his scant 16 years and feeble constitution, managed to enlist in the Army of Observation under General Greene, and from that time enjoyed a steady rise in health and prestige. In 1780, as a captain in the Rhode Island forces in New Jersey under Colonel Engel, he met and married Phoebe Hetfield of Elizabethtown, whom he brought to Providence upon his honorable discharge in the following year. The young soldier's return was not a thing of unmitigated happiness. The house, it is true, was still in good condition, and the street had been widened and changed in a name from Back Street to Benefit Street, but Mercy Dexter's once robust frame had undergone a sad and curious decay, so that she was now a stooped and pathetic figure, with hollow voice and disconcerting pallor, qualities shared to a singular degree by the one remaining servant, Maria. In the autumn of 1782, Phoebe Harris gave birth to a stillborn daughter, and on the 15th of the next May, Mercy Dexter took leave of a useful, austere, and virtuous life. William Harris, at last, thoroughly convinced of the radically unhealthful nature of his abode, now took steps towards quitting it and closing it forever. Securing temporary quarters for himself and his wife at the newly opened Golden Ball Inn, he arranged for the building of a new and finer house in Westminster Street, in the growing part of the town across Great Bridge. There, in 1785, his son Doughty was born, and there the family dwelt, till the encroachments of commerce drove them back across the river and over the hill to Engel Street, in the newer East Side residence district, where the late Archer Harris built his sumptuous but hideous French-roofed mansion in 1876. William and Phoebe both succumbed to the yellow fever epidemic of 1797, but Doughty was brought up by his cousin Rathbone Harris, Peleg's son. Rathbone was a practical man and rented the Benefit Street house despite William's wish to keep it vacant. He considered it an obligation to his ward to make the most of all the boy's property, nor did he concern himself with the deaths and illnesses which caused so many changes of tenants, or the steadily growing aversion with which the house was generally regarded. It is likely that he felt only vexation when, in 1804, the town council ordered him to fumigate the place with sulphur, tar, and gum camphor on account of the much discussed deaths of 4 persons, presumably caused by the then diminishing fever epidemic. They said the place had a febrile smell. Doughty himself thought little of the house, for he grew up to be a privateersman and served with distinction on the Vigilant under Captain Coon in the War of 1812. He returned unharmed, married in 1814, and became a father on that memorable night of September 23rd, 1815, when a great gale drove the waters of the bay over half the town and floated a tall sloop well up Westminster Street, so that its masts almost tapped the Harris windows in symbolic affirmation that the new boy, welcome, was a seaman's son. Welcome did not survive his father, but lived to perish gloriously at Fredericksburg in 1862. Neither he nor his son Archer knew of the Shunned House as other than a nuisance and almost impossible to rent, perhaps on account of the mustiness and sickly odor of unkempt old age. Indeed, it never was rented after a series of deaths culminating in 1861, which the excitement of the war tended to throw into obscurity. Carrington Harris, last of the male line, knew it only as a deserted and somewhat picturesque center of legend, until I told him my experience. He had meant to tear it down and build an apartment house on the site, but after my account, decided to let it stand, install plumbing, and rent it. Nor has he yet had any difficulty in obtaining tenants. The horror has gone. And certain instances have certain effects that are inherently physical. Some can kill bacteria and viruses. Psychological associations, more than anything else. Camphor is actually a pretty good incense regarding funerals. I have a little bottle of camphor somewhere, I think. I don't think I've used it. That I set aside as like, well, okay, here's my burial perfume. And urns. I guess that goes back to ancient Greece, doesn't it? And as you know, in my graveyard videos, I've seen a lot of these empty urns, which are largely used as flower pots, but some of the forms you kind of think, oh, that's not really designed as a flower pot, is it? Chapter 3. It may well be imagined how powerfully I was affected by the annals of the Harrises. In this continuous record, there seemed to me to brood a persistent evil beyond anything in nature I had known it. An evil clearly connected with the house and not with the family. This impression was confirmed by my uncle's less systematic array of miscellaneous data. Legends transcribed from servant gossip, cuttings from the paper, copies of death certificates by fellow physicians, and the like. All this material I cannot hope to give, for my uncle was a tireless antiquarian and very deeply interested in the Shunned House, but I may refer to several dominant points which earned notice by their recurrence through many reports from diverse sources. For example, the servant gossip was practically unanimous in attributing to the fungus and malodorous cellar of the house a vast supremacy in evil influence. There had been servants, Anne White especially, who would not use the cellar kitchen, and at least 3 well-defined legends bore upon the queer, quasi-human, or diabolic outlines assumed by tree roots and patches of mold in that region. These latter narratives interested me profoundly, on account of what I had seen in my boyhood. But I felt that most of the significance had in each case been largely obscured by additions from the common stock of local ghost lore. Anne White, with her Exeter superstition, had promulgated the most extravagant and at the same time most constant tale, alleging that there must lie burned beneath the house of one of these vampires, the dead who retain their bodily form and live on the blood or breath of the living, whose hideous legions send their preying shapes or spirits abroad by night. To destroy a vampire one must, the grandmothers say, exhume it and burn its heart, or at least drive a stake through that organ. And Anne's dogged insistence on a search under the cellar had been prominent in bringing about her discharge. Her tales, however, commanded a wide audience, and were the more readily accepted because the house indeed stood on land once used for burial purposes. To me, their interest depended less on this circumstance than on the peculiarly appropriate way in which they dovetailed with certain other things. The complaints of the departing servant, Preserved Smith, who had preceded Anne and never heard of her, that something sucked his breath at night. The death certificates of the fever victims of 1804, issued by Dr. Chad Hopkins, showed the 4 deceased persons all unaccountably lacking in blood, and the obscure passages of Robbie Harris's ravings, where she complained of the sharp teeth of a glassy-eyed, half-visible presence. Free from unwarranted superstition though I am, these things produced in me an odd sensation, which was intensified by a pair of widely separated newspaper cuttings relating to deaths in the Shunned House, one from the Providence Gazette and Country Journal of April 12, 1815, and the other from the Daily Transcript and Chronicle of October 27th, 1845, each of which detailed an appallingly grisly circumstance whose duplication was remarkable. It seems that in both instances the dying person in 1815 of a gentle old lady named Stafford, and in 1845 a schoolteacher of middle age named Eleazar Murphy became transfigured in a horrible way, glaring ghastly and attempting to bite the throat of the attending physician. Even more puzzling, though, was the final case which put an end to the renting of the house, a series of anemia deaths, preceded by progressive madness, wherein the patient would craftily attempt the lives of his relatives by incisions in the neck or wrist. This was in 1860 and 1861, when my uncle had just begun his medical practice, and before leaving for the front, he heard much of it from his elder professional colleagues. The really inexplicable thing was the way in which the victims, ignorant people, for the ill-smelling and widely shunned house, could now be rented to no others, would babble maledictions in French, a language they could not possibly have studied to any extent. It made one think of poor Roby Harris, nearly a century before, and so moved my uncle that he commenced collecting historical data on the house after listening, some time subsequent to his return from the war, to the first-hand account of Doctors Chase and Whitmarsh. Indeed, I could see that my uncle had thought deeply on the subject, and that he was glad of my own interest, an open-minded and sympathetic interest which enabled him to discuss with me matters at which others would merely have laughed. His fancy had not gone so far as mine, but he felt that the place was rare in its imaginative potentialities, and worthy of note as an inspiration in the field of the grotesque and macabre. For my part, I was disposed to take the whole subject with profound seriousness, and begun at once to not only review the evidence, but to accumulate as much more as I could. I talked with the elderly Archer Harris, then owner of the house, many times before his death in 1916, and obtained from him and his still surviving maiden sister, Alice, an authentic collaboration of all the family data my uncle had collected. When, however, I asked them what connection with France or its language the house could have, they confessed themselves as frankly baffled and ignorant as I. Archer knew nothing, and all that Miss Harris could say was that an old illusion her grandfather, Duty Harris, had heard of might have shed a little light. The old seaman who had survived his son Welcome's death in battle by 2 years had not himself known the legend, but recalled that his earliest nurse, the ancient Maria Robbins, seemed darkly aware of something that might have lent a weird significance to the French raving of Roby Harris, which she had so often heard during the last days of that hapless woman. Maria had been at the Shunned House from 1769 till the removal of the family in 1783, and had seen Mercy Dexter die. Once she hinted to the child duty of a somewhat peculiar circumstance in Mercy's last moments, but he had soon forgotten all about it, save that it was something peculiar. The granddaughter, moreover, recalled even this much with difficulty. She and her brother were not so much interested in the house as was Archer's son, Carrington, the present owner, with whom I talked after my experience. Having exhausted the Harris family of all the information I could furnish, I turned my attention to early town records, with the zeal more penetrating than that which my uncle had occasionally shown in the same work. What I wished was a comprehensive history of the site from its very settlement in 1636, or even before. If any Narragansett Indian legend could be unearthed to supply the data, I found at the start that the land had been part of the long strip of home lot granted originally to John Throckmorton, one of many similar strips, beginning at the town street beside the river and extending up over the hill to a line roughly corresponding with the modern Hope Street, the Throckmorton lot, had later, of course, been much subdivided, and I became very assiduous in tracing that section through which Back or Benefit Street was later run. It had, as rumor indeed said, been the Throckmorton graveyard, but as I examined the records more carefully, I found that the graves had all been transferred at an early date to the northern burial ground on the Pawtucket West Road. Then, suddenly, I came, by a rare piece of chance, since it was not in the main body of records and might easily have been missed, upon something which aroused my keenest eagerness. Fitting in, as it did, with several of the queerest phases of the affair, it was the record of a lease in 1696 of a small tract of ground to an Athena Roulette and wife. And at last, the French element had appeared. So, Athena Roulette? Maybe? I don't know. At last, the French element had appeared. That, and another deeper element of horror, which the name conjured up from the darkest recesses of my weird and heterogeneous reading, and I feverishly studied the plating of the locality as it had been before the cutting through and partial straightening of Back Street between 1747 and 1758. I found what I had half expected, that where the Shunned House now stood, the Roulettes had laid out their graveyard behind a one-story, an attic college, and that no record of any transfer of graves existed, from the North Burial Ground, I guess. The document existed, indeed, ended in much confusion, and I was forced to ransack both the Rhode Island Historical Society and Shepley Library before I could find a local door which the name of Etienne Roulette would unlock. In the end, I did find something of such vague and but monstrous import that I set about at once to examine the cellar of the Shunned House itself with a new and excited minuteness. The Roulettes, it seemed, had come in 1696 from East Greenwich, down the west shore of Narragansett Bay. They were Huguenots from Canute and had encountered much opposition before the Providence selectmen allowed them to settle in town. Unpopularity had dodged them in East Greenwich, whither they had come in 1686, after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and rumor said that the cause of dislike extended beyond mere racial and national prejudice, are the land disputes, which involved other French settlers with the English in rivalries, which not even Governor Andros could quell, but their ardent Protestantism, too ardent, some whispered, and their evident distress when virtually driven from the village down the bay, had moved the sympathy of the town's fathers. Here the strangers had been granted a haven, and the swarthy Etienne Roulette, less apt at agriculture than at reading queer books and drawing queer diagrams, was given a clerical post in the warehouse at Pardon Tillinghast's Wharf, far south, in Town Street. There had, however, been a riot of some sort later on, perhaps 40 years after old Roulette's death, and no one seemed to hear of the family after that. For a century and more it appeared the Roulettes had been well remembered and frequently discussed as vivid incidents in the quiet life of a New England seaport. Attina's son, Paul, a surly fellow, whose erratic conduct had probably provoked the riot which wiped out the family, was particularly a source of speculation. And though Providence never shared the witchcraft panics of her Puritan neighbors, it was freely intimated by old wives that his prayers were neither uttered at the proper time nor directed toward the proper object. Pretty much every substantially textual religious tradition mentions prayer times and other conditions that prayer is not just, oh, I'm going to say what I want, The words mean more like salah, the Semitic term. All this had undoubtedly formed the basis of the legend known by old Maria Robbins. What relation it had been to the French ravings of Roby Harris and other inhabitants of the Shunned House, imagination or future discovery alone could determine. I wondered how many of those who had known the legends realized the additional link with the terrible which my wider reading had given me, that ominous item in the annals of morbid horror which tells of the creature Jacques Roulet of Caude, who in 1598 was condemned to death as a demoniac, but afterwards saved from the stake by the Paris Parliament and shut in a madhouse. He had been found covered with blood and shreds of flesh in a wood shortly after the killing and rending of a boy by a pair of wolves. One wolf was seen to lope away unhurt. Surely a pretty hearthside tale with a queer significance as to name and place, but I decided that the Providence gossips could not have generally known of it. Had they known, the coincidence of names would have brought some drastic and frightened action. Indeed, might not its limited whispering have precipitated the final riot which erased the Roulettes from the town? I now visited the accursed place with increased frequency, studying the unwholesome vegetation of the garden, examining all the walls of the building, and poring over every inch of the earthen cellar floor. Finally, with Carrington Harris's permission, I fitted a key to the disused door opening from the cellar directly upon Benefit Street, preferring to have a more immediate success to the outside world than the dark stairs, ground floor hall, and front door could give. There, where morbidity lurked most thickly, I searched and poked during long afternoons, when the sunlight filtered in through the cobwebbed above mustiness ground windows, and a sense of security glowed from the unlocked door, which placed me only a few feet from the placid sidewalk outside. Nothing new rewarded my efforts, only the same depressing mustiness and faint suggestions of noxious odors and nitrous outlines on the floor, and I fancy that many pedestrians must have watched me curiously through the broken panes. At length, upon a suggestion of my uncle's, I decided to try the spot nocturnally, and one stormy midnight ran the beams of an electric torch over the moldy floor with its uncanny shapes and distortion, half phosphorescent fungi. The place had dispirited me curiously that evening, and I was almost prepared when I saw, or thought I saw, amidst the whitish deposits, a particularly sharp definition of the huddled form I had suspected from boyhood. Its clearness was astonishing and unprecedented, and as I watched, I seemed to see again the thin, yellowish, shimmering exhalation which had startled me on that rainy afternoon so many years before. Above the anthropomorphic patch of mold by the fireplace it rose, a subtle, sickish, almost luminous vapor, which, as it hung, trembling in the dampness, seemed to develop vague and shocking suggestions of form, gradually trailing off into nebulous decay and passing up into the blackness of the great chimney with the fetor in its wake. It is truly horrible, and the more so to me because of what I knew of the spot. Refusing to flee, I watched it fade. And as I watched, I felt that it was in turn watching me greedily with eyes more imaginable than visible. When I told my uncle about it, he was greatly aroused, interested. And after a tense hour of reflection, arrived at a definite and drastic decision, weighing in his mind the importance of the matter and the significance of our relation to it. He insisted that we both test and, if possible, destroy the horror of the house by a joint night or nights of aggressive vigil in that musty and fungus-cursed cellar. Now you can't destroy spirits by just being a good Christian or whatever these people planned. They have respite, right? So the destruction of the heart, right? So particularly in African faiths, there's the talk of the heart as by which you're judged. And by African, I mean, south of Turkey and west of Persia, right? Well, I guess, you go past the Arabian Peninsula, some Africa kind of does stick out on that, on the east side, but you know what I mean. And so, but you are supposed to involve your emotions in your religion. It's like, well, I don't really have much emotion when it comes to my spirituality, but other things, my heart's in it. It's like, well, put your heart in it, metaphorically or otherwise, And the other thing I guess I would like to say something about before moving on to chapter 4 is, okay, if riots cause a change, they should address the problems which related in the riots, not say, oh, no, how dare you complain and have a different opinion, or whatever the deal is. Now, people may need to be tried for crimes involved in their riots, but, there's more, too, than, oh, you gotta stop people from thinking different or something like that, because thinking different is seldom the problem by itself. Okay, let's. So, chapter 4 here. On Wednesday, June 25th, 1919, after a proper notification of Carrington Harris, which did not include surmises as to what we expected to find, my uncle and I conveyed to the Shunned House 2 camp chairs and a folding camp cot, together with some scientific mechanism of greater weight and intricacy. These we placed in the cellar during the day, screening the windows with paper, and planning to return in the evening for our first vigil. We had locked the door from the cellar to the ground floor, and having a key to the outside cellar door, were prepared to leave our expense and delicate apparatus, which we had obtained secretly and at great cost, as many days as our vigils might be protracted. It was our design to sit together till very late, and then watch singly till dawn in 2-hour stretches. Myself first, and then my companion, the inactive member, resting on the cot. The natural leadership, in which my uncle procured the instruments from the laboratories of Brown University, and the Cranston Street Armory, and instinctively assumed direction of our venture was a marvelous commentary on the potential vitality and resilience of a man of 81. Adahu Whipple had lived according to hygienic laws. He had preached as a physician, but not for what happened later. Would be here in full vigor today. Only 2 persons suspected what did happen, Carrington Harris and myself. I had to tell Harris because he owned the house and deserved to know what had gone out of it. Then, too, he had spoken to him in advance of our quest and felt, after my uncle's going, that he would understand and assist me in some vitally necessary public explanations. He turned very pale, but agreed to help me, and decided that it would now be safe to rent the house. To declare that we were not nervous on that rainy night of watching would be an exaggeration, both gross and ridiculous. We were not, as I have said, in any sense childishly superstitious, but scientific study and reflection had taught us that the known universe of 3 dimensions embraces the merest fraction of the whole cosmos of substance and energy. In this case, an overwhelming preponderance of evidence from numerous authentic sources pointed to the tenacious existence of certain forces of great power. So far as the human point of view is concerned, exceptional malignancy. To say that we actually believed in vampires or werewolves would be a carelessly inclusive statement. Rather, it must be said that we were not prepared to deny the possibility of certain unfamiliar and unclassified modifications of vital force and attenuated matter existing very infrequently in 3-dimensional space because of its more intimate connection with other spatial units, yet close enough to the boundary of our own to furnish us occasional manifestations which we, for lack of proper vantage point, may never hope to understand. In short, it seemed to my uncle and me that an incontrovertible array of facts pointed to some lingering influence in the Shunned House, traceable to one or another of the ill-favored French settlers of 2 centuries before, and still operative through rare and unknown laws of atomic and electronic motion, that the family of Rollet had possessed an abnormal affinity for outer circles of entity, dark spheres, which for normal folk hold only repulsion and terror. Their recorded history seemed to prove, had not then, the rites of those bygone 1730s set moving certain kinetic patterns in the morbid brain of one or more of them, notably the sinister Paul Rollet, which obscurely survived, the bodies murdered and buried by the mob, and continued to function in some multiple-dimensioned space along the original lines of force determined by a frantic hatred of the encroaching community. Nowadays, the most murderous mobs and stuff like this are treated as peaceful protesters. And yeah, so the seriousness of what happened and what continues to go on is buried, right? Such a thing was surely not a physical or biochemical impossibility in the light of newer science, which includes the theories of relativity and intra-atomic action. One might easily imagine an alien nucleus of substance or energy, formless or otherwise, kept alive by imperceptible or immaterial subtractions from the life force or bodily tissue and fluids of other and more palpably living things into which it penetrates, and with which and with whose fabric it sometimes completely merges itself. It might be actively hostile, or it might be dedicated, or it might be dictated merely by blind motives of self-preservation. In any case, such a monster must of necessity be, in our scheme of things, an anom- an anomaly and an intruder whose extirpation forms a primary duty with every man, not an enemy to the world's life, health, and sanity. Yeah, obviously, you got to do what's good for the world. Although, it's not always what people say what is good for the world, though. But what baffled us was our utter ignorance of the aspect in which we might encounter the thing. No sane person had ever seen it, and few had ever felt it definitely. It might be pure energy, a form ethereal and outside the realm of substance, or it might be partially material, some unknown and equivocal mass of plasticity, capable of changing at will to nebulous approximations of the solid, liquid, gaseous, or tenuously unparticled states. That anthropomorphic patch of mold on the floor, the form of the yellowish vapor, and the curvature of the tree roots of some of the old tales, all argued at least a remote and reminiscent connection with the human shape. But how representative or permanent that similarity might be, none could say with any kind of certainty. We had devised two weapons to fight it, a large and specially fitted Crookes tube, operated by powerful storage batteries, and provided with peculiar screens and reflectors in case it proved intangible and opposable only by vigorously destructive ether radiations, and a pair of military flamethrowers of the sort used in the World War, in case it proved partially material and susceptible of mechanical destruction. For the like, the superstitious exter rustics, we were prepared to burn the thing's heart out, if heart existed to burn. All this aggressive mechanism we set in the cellar in positions carefully arranged with reference to the cot and chairs, and to the spot before the fireplace where the mold had taken strange shapes. That suggestive patch, by the way, was only faintly visible when we placed our furniture and instruments, and when we returned that evening for the actual actual vigil. For a moment I half doubted that I had ever seen it in the more definitely limbed form. But then I thought of the legends. Our cellar vigil began at 10 p.m. daylight savings time, and as it continued we found no promise of pertinent developments. A weak, filtered glow from the rain-harassed street lamps outside, and a feeble phosphorescence from the detestable fungi within showed the dripping stone of the walls, from which all traces of whitewash had vanished. The dank, fetid, and mildew-tainted hard earth floor, with its obscene fungi, the rotting remains of what had been stools, chairs, and tables, and other more shapeless furniture, the heavy planks and massive beams of the ground floor overhead, the decrepit plank door leading to bins and chambers beneath other parts of the house, the crumbling stone staircase with a ruined handrail of wood, and the crude and cavernous fireplace of blackened brick, where rusted iron fragments revealed the past presence of hooks and irons, spit crane, and a door to the Dutch oven. These things, and our austere cot and camp chairs, and the heavy and intricate destructive machinery we had brought. We had, as in my own former explorations, left the door to the street unlocked so that a direct and practical path of escape might lie open in case of manifestations beyond our power to deal with. It was our idea that our continued nocturnal presence would call forth whatever malign entity lurked there, and that being prepared, we could dispose of the thing with one or the other of our provided means as soon as we had recognized and observed it sufficiently. How long might require to evoke and extinguish the thing, we had no notion. It occurred to us, too, that our venture was far from safe, for in what strength the thing might appear no one could tell, but we deemed the game worth the hazard, and embarked on it alone and unhesitatingly, conscious that the seeking of outside aid would only expose us to ridicule and perhaps defeat our entire purpose. Such was our frame of mind as we talked, far into the night, till my uncle's growing drowsiness made me remind him to lie down for his 2 hours' sleep. Something like fear chilled me as I sat there in the small hours alone. I say alone, for one who sits by a sleeper is indeed alone, perhaps more alone than he can realize. I personally am of the opinion that it's impossible for anybody to ever be alone, but my uncle breathed heavily, his deep inhalations and exhalations accompanied by the rain outside and punctuated by another nerve-racking sound of distant dripping water within, for the house was repulsively damp, even in dry weather, and in this storm, positively swamp-like. I studied the loose, antique masonry of the walls in the fungus light, and the feeble rays which stole in from the street through the screened window, and once, when the noisome atmosphere of the place seemed about to sicken me, I opened the door and looked up and down the street, feasting my eyes on similar sights and my nostrils on wholesome air. Still nothing occurred to reward my watching, and I yawned repeatedly, fatigue getting the better of apprehension. And the grumbling stomach is getting better of me, Then the stirring of my uncle in his sleep attracted my notice. He had turned quite restlessly on the cot several times during the latter half of the first hour, but now he was breathing with unusual irregularity, occasionally heaving a sigh which held more than a few of the qualities of a choking moan. I turned my electric flashlight on him and found his face averted, so rising and crossing to the other side of the cot, I again flashed the light to see if he seemed in any pain. What saw unnerved me, and most surprisingly considered its relative triviality. It must have been merely the association of any odd circumstance with the sinister nature of our location and mission, for surely the circumstance was not in itself frightful or unnatural. It was merely that my uncle's facial expression, disturbed, no doubt, by the strange dreams in which our situation prompted, betrayed considerable agitation, and seemed not at all characteristic of him. His habitual expression was one of kindly and well-bred calm, whereas now a variety of emotions seemed struggling within him. I think, on the whole, that it was this variety which chiefly disturbed me. My uncle, as he gasped, tossed, in increasing perturbation, and with his eyes now started open, seemed not one, but many men, and suggested a curious quality of alienage from himself. And I guess I will leave the rest of 4 and 5 for the next program. I don't know, maybe tomorrow.